Okay, so we know that the ego resolves conflicts, right? And I told you it gets some help in doing that. Now we're going to look at the defense mechanisms, and I like to think of this as like little toolbox that we carry around, where we have these defense mechanisms that the ego can use um, sometimes to oftentimes actually to very quickly fix something, not in the very best way, but good enough, right? So this is kind of most of the ways, in fact, all of them except for the bottom one here on this list, okay, are not the most functional way of handling something, but they're like putting a band-aid on it. If you think about it, the id is, or the ego is going to be very busy all of the time resolving these conflicts between the superego and the conscious and the unconscious, and it needs to reserve its resources for, it has bigger fish to fry for bigger problems. So oftentimes people have a tendency, we all have a tendency to use defense mechanisms. And which ones we use, that can vary between us. We all have a few of our favorites. And oftentimes as you sit here and listen to these, you can identify your own. But we're going to go through this list one at a time now. And we're going to start out with repression. Okay, so some of you are familiar with this one, and you might think of it as, repressing or pushing material down into the unconscious. Material, for instance, that's just too uncomfortable to think about. We talked, for instance, about somebody who didn't think of themselves as bigoted, but then realized that maybe they displayed a behavior exhibiting bigotry, and they could either confront that in themselves, or they could repress it, right? Not even remember it if they tried to later on. This one's really interesting. Sometimes people think of it as motivated forgetting. Okay? What's really interesting about this is that this doesn't usually happen. In fact, you tell me what happens if you try not to think about something. What if oh, it's just not comfortable, or it's too painful. I don't want to remember it. I don't want to think about it. What happens? That's all you can think about, right? So usually we see the opposite. If people try not to think about something, it actually becomes what we call hyper accessible. Okay? But there's no denying that sometimes this really does happen, repression. Okay? So pushing something down into the unconscious, you're not able to remember it. Now, the second one is projection. This one is also interesting. And so far, they're really aptly named. Their names will help you remember what they are. Okay? That's true with projection. If you are uncomfortable with something in yourself, sometimes we have a real tendency then to project it onto others. So you might know of somebody who is a compulsive liar, and instead of accepting that in themselves, they always think other people are lying. They don't trust what anybody else says. That would be a great example of projection. Okay. Now, this third one, displacement, again, very aptly named. This is displacing your frustration on another living being. And I want you to remember that, another living being, because it's really going to help you not to get this mixed up later on with regression. Sometimes people get those mixed up. Okay. Reaction formation. Reaction formation. Let me go back to displacement just for a second here. Why would somebody do that? Well, usually what they're looking for is a scapegoat. Not always, but usually they're just looking for a scapegoat. In other words, if you took your aggression out on the person that made you angry, that person might have power over you, like a parent or a boss or supervisor, right? And could, reciprocate in a really harmful way. And so you take your frustration out on somebody else. Then there's reaction formation. Now, this is the one where the name is not helpful at all, I don't think. Okay, so I want you to remember, though, that reaction formation, what it means. Interesting. Somebody has difficulty accepting something in themselves. Sometimes people have a tendency to act the complete opposite. Okay, you might say, well, I don't get it. Let me think of a good example for you here, because this is usually something really difficult to accept in the South. Let's say, for instance, somebody, let's imagine that a mother does not like her child. Now, some of you even giggled there, just because when I say this in a live class, I know that a lot of people will chuckle. But it's kind of a shocked chuckle, right? It's that kind of humor that shocks you, and it's not really humorous. It's just that that's your reaction to that shock. Because that is not acceptable, right? That's not the way it's supposed to be. If we can count on one person liking you, that should be mom. But here's the deal. You can imagine that if that really were the case, that is something that the mother may not be able to truly accept about herself, but instead she might actually treat that child as her very favorite. It's a great example of reaction formation. Okay, now regression. Okay, now we're back to a really helpful name, because regression is regressing to childlike behavior. Regressing to childlike behavior. Now, let me tell you something. I think your text, many texts, will say childish behavior. I want you to remember it as childlike behavior. And the reason for that is oftentimes it is childish behavior, but not always. So let me give you an example when it's not. How many of you have watched I Love Lucy reruns and are familiar with that show? If you are, then you'll know that Lucy's husband had a tendency to do something when he would get very frustrated. He would have a tendency to start what? He had a tendency to start speaking in Spanish. And so for him, that was a childlike behavior, because that was his first tongue. That was the tongue he spoke when he was a child, the language that he spoke as a child. But it's certainly not childish. Okay, that's why I want you to remember this as regressing to childlike behavior. Oftentimes, more so than not, it is childish, but not always. Okay, it always is, though, childlike. And then there's rationalization. Great name. Okay, you might think just by looking at it, well, that's making excuses. Yes, that's exactly what it is. Making excuses that on the surface kind of sound logical. Sounds like you're using logic. Okay? Identification, okay, is identifying with a group or an individual to make yourself feel more important. Okay? Identifying with a group or an individual to make yourself feel more important. And then there's that last one that I told you was unique, because it is actually very functional. It's not a band-aid. It's not a temporary solution. One of those solutions like the others that doesn't really get at the problem, right? Sublimation is really interesting because it's taking negative energy and using it, turning it into something very positive. Using negative energy, but producing from that energy something that's very positive. Okay? So, could be like a painting or a poem. Have you ever noticed that some of the best song lyrics are just heartbreaking, about somebody breaking up with someone else? Look at that. They had this really heartbreaking negative experience, and yet they ended up turning it into a hit song. Megabucks, right? Okay, the defense mechanisms.